I can't see anyone, so I'm just going to assume I'm talking to nothingness, to blackness, which is cool. It's a good way to start talking about color with black. So I'm going to talk about the interaction of color systems. Some of you might know that I stole this, or borrowed part of this title of a very well-known book called Interaction of Color by Joseph Albers. And I don't know if you could see that on the screen, but one of his famous experiments was the two boxes looking like it was the opposite color from the other side, but they're actually the same color. So I'm going to talk a bit about that theory and color influence, and also about building color in design systems. So as Una mentioned, I'm Diana. I'm broccolini on most parts of the internet. I am a design systems manager at GitHub. And I work from home. I wanted to add this slide because I wanted to thank you all for getting up early. At this time of day, I'm usually still in my pajamas, dancing around with my cat. Have a cat. Maybe not quite as awesome as this dancing, though. So thank you for being here. And I also wanted to call out that it's partly Jina and Cap's fault that I work on design systems, seeing as I'm following Cap today. So way back when I was still in Australia and had realized that maybe using products like Adobe Go Live, if anyone remembers that, and Dreamweaver and things, I wanted to like hand code my CSS. And this is one of the few technical books I've actually read from start to finish, which Jina wrote a chapter for. And fast forward to several years later, I found myself chatting to Cap in a coffee shop for hours, and then joining Etsy and moving to New York, where I ended up on the seller tools team, and we ended up building a new style guide. And that's what made me start to realize that's what I really wanted to do. The echo is crazy in here. So last year, in March at last year's Clarity conference, I gave a talk, a lightning talk, and coincidentally that same day, I had just been made the lead for the design systems team. And I was really excited. This is how I was feeling. I was like, yes, finally, I get to like really work on this stuff and do this full time. This is really what I want to do. And that excitement quickly changes to a lot of brain melting problems, confusion about why someone ever wrote code like that. And then a lot of like communication and trying to make friends and win people over to adopt the design system. So, one of the most challenging parts of the work that I've done so far was on color systems, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So what's challenging? What's so hard about working with color? Well, one of the things is that color is subjective. There's a lot of things that affect how people respond and perceive color. Things like their background, current trends, and even their mood or their age. There's also an absolute ton to learn. I really laughed when I saw this tweet recently, because I feel the same like 6 months later. It's just there's endless amounts of stuff to learn. And yeah, Jackson's response sounds like you understand color now, when you realize that you're never going to learn it all. So I wanted to talk about what you kind of end up learning about color, maybe at school or college, or many blog posts. And you'll often see things like this, with like triadic and like complementary color schemes. Back in the day, you may have used Adobe Cooler, which is now called Color. I liked it when it was cooler because it was cooler. So this is a lot of things these are a lot of the things that informed us about color, and then learning about, like RGB is additive and CMYK is subtractive. And then despite thinking that maybe these are just really cool, beautiful mugs, Pantone is also a color system as well. What you might not learn about, and you might discover maybe through design tools, is that a really intuitive way, or much more intuitive way of looking at color is with hue, saturation, and brightness. I didn't realize that maybe this was something that lots of people hadn't discovered yet, and I actually can't even remember when I had discovered it. But I saw Dustin tweet this, and a lot of people respond to that going, oh my God, yes, this is so much better. So that's hue, saturation, brightness, but then there's also this other thing called hue, saturation, lightness. So then you might be wondering, okay, so is HSB the same as HSL? And there's this other thing called HSV. So it gets a bit confusing already. The good thing is that these are both alternative representations of RGB. They're ideally meant to be a more intuitive way of perceiving color for humans. So it turns out HSB and HSV are the same, but they are not the same as HSL. So here's a nerdy diagram, just so I can look cool and sciencey, of the HSL and HSV chroma. And you can see they're a bit different. So HSL works by tinting colors with white, whereas HSV or HSB lightens the color by just tinting alone. So they work a bit differently. A really good way of seeing this, and lots more color variations, is on a site I found called colorizer.org. And you can see that the hue is the same, but then the saturation and lightness or brightness is different. When you get to extremes like full values of red, green, and blue, sometimes those things will line up. And then looking at color pickers in color tools, this is how a lot of tools have this very similar sort of layout with a gradient square of color with some sliders for saturation or brightness in here, sorry. And then sometimes you'll see things like this as well, but they don't really represent the color spectrum very accurately. Some hues have more range in brightness and darkness. This is a quote from Albert Henry Munsell. He said, "The desire to fit chosen contour, such as the pyramid, cone, or cube, coupled with a lack of proper tests, has led to many distorted statements of color relations." Also note, I left the English spelling of color there. And Rune Madsen summed it up quite well. It's really all this history and years of study of color is kind of neglected in our color tools. And this might be why I found myself using so many different tools when I was trying to work on our color system, because no one's quite maybe got it right yet, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at color. So we haven't even begun designing our color system yet, and we've found out that there's tons to learn. We're probably never going to learn everything about color, and maybe you'll never be an expert, and color tools are broken, womp womp, surprise. But maybe on a positive note, maybe that's good. I don't know about you, but I really like it when there's tons to learn. I get excited about that. I'm still excited about learning about color. I feel like I've only just barely scratched the surface. And as a systems designer, you also have the opportunity to help make working with color easier for other people. Also, it's an opportunity for some nice puns in your commits, like I see red people and orange you glad. I updated these variables. So we're back to feeling a bit like this again, hopefully. So let's dig into creating the system. So hopefully, whenever you're doing any project, you're thinking, why are we doing this? And for GitHub, for anyone really, hopefully you're starting off with something that's useful for people using the system. So you might have user stories along the lines of this, that you're trying to make color easier to work with. You want the designers using the system to be able to work with color and implement it successfully. A problem unique, well maybe not unique to GitHub, was that we had all of these 2,449 hex values that were not connected in any way. So making color easy to work with, we were already kind of like failing at that user story. And that also made maintainability hard for the people working on design systems. We had some problems with, we had a few variables for color, but they were things like this that didn't really promote reuse. That kind of suggests that I can only use flash text yellow for a flash text. But of course, people used it in other things as well, which doesn't help with like making things easy when you're working with code. I think that can contribute to causing confusion. Another problem was that we had a lot of color combinations that were just really badly failing color contrast-wise, which is definitely a problem. And then our colors were looking a bit drab. One of the designers dubbed our link color blue, which is quite prominent on the site, Dad Jeans blue, because it looks like it's literally been color picked from that. So we were feeling that it was time to maybe give things a refresh. But also, the reason that this kicked off when it did is because of an opportunity. And I think this is an interesting thing to consider and maybe be aware of. One of the other teams was working on a big refresh of our logged out marketing sort of pages. And they wanted to work, they wanted more colors and they wanted to be consistent about how they were using colors. And that was an opportunity for design systems to sort of jump on that bandwagon and put some momentum behind this work. That, of course, had to be balanced with not blocking that ship or slowing that down. And so when you're doing that, you need to have sort of have a plan B sort of mentality so that you can not block those ships. But it also can really help get things done faster, and that worked out for us. So let's get into the details of things. So building the palette. About a month before I started working on the color system, we updated the site header to be dark. It was white, and we went dark, which was controversial to some. I didn't lead that work, but when that was happening, I jumped in, and I was like, I'd already been thinking about color, and it was an opportunity to add some hue to that dark color. So all of our grays up until then had been really flat grays. So before it was 333, and we moved to a grayscale that had a blue hue to it, which just starts to help with that sort of drab feeling, or getting away from that drab feeling. It also was an opportunity to darken our darkest gray, which just helps a little bit with expanding our range of accessible color contrast combinations. So I had already started on that. So that gave me the starting point of okay, I know what our grayscale is our grays are going to start to look like. But then I needed to get into our primary colors, and especially our blue, because that was the one that really needed updating, and also because it's our link color just used everywhere. And we tried and tested a lot of different variations. Some of those were quickly rolled out because they didn't provide good enough contrast, or because they looked too drab. They weren't getting us away from Dad Jeans blue enough. But of course, to be able to really test whether that blue color worked, I couldn't do that without looking at other colors. And it's difficult to say, okay, now I need to have all the other colors all at once and test everything all together. That's not going to happen. But what I started to do is pick off some of the most common color combinations that I knew we were going to have to make work. So things like we have alert messages that have a dark blue over a light blue. And we have lots of light gray backgrounds, and blue links over that need to work. So I started to flesh out the rest of the colors. And but what this really looks like, so if we move the darkest gray into the grayscale, because really it's part of that family, what it really looks like is like moving up and down these scales to flesh out the different shades. And so I found myself focusing on these sorts of ranges, very dark ends of the spectrum when I knew those colors needed to work on a light background. Often you want to use two colors in the same sort of hue. And then sometimes we have places where we have a big block of color, maybe it's using a background or an icon or something, and then text with it, and sometimes you want that text a bit darker, but the background a bit lighter. And that's why there's some of those, like the orange and the red and the green close together. And then obviously grays, if you use GitHub, you might notice there's a lot of grays. And so a few more of those were picked off and tested early on. So as well as starting to flesh out those colors and test those colors, I needed to start testing them in real components and in the UI. And I prioritized this by like picking off like really highly used components, iconic pieces of the UI, which I'll get to in a second, and like really frequently used pages. So like highly used components, things like buttons. For us, our status labels are really important for the merge status. Things like our alert messages. And then for us, things that are perhaps iconic are the contribution graph. I'm not sure how well the difference in color shows up here, but the top one is before and the bottom one is after we updated the colors. And then pages like our repo pages are really highly visited. So those were the sorts of pages where I started to test all of the colors working together. And this is where I started to notice like that colors influence each other in the UI. I spent quite a long time getting the orange to be the right orange that felt okay in close proximity to the blue, and how it was affected by the sort of light gray around it. It was really interesting to me how those could affect each other. And that's around the time where someone recommended to me that I read Interaction of Color. And I was like, oh, okay, I get this now. One of the mistakes that we made that if you are a user of GitHub and were following Twitter at the time was that, objectively made a mistake, I guess, was that we made our file icons this saturated blue. And when we shipped this, that was the thing that people most commented on. They were like, oh my God, I can't cope with all this blue. It doesn't seem that bad now, but like in contrast to the old design, it really changed things. So the area that color, the mass that color takes, like also influences how it's perceived. So I was testing out individual colors, starting to flesh out the family, testings in the UI, testings on individual components in isolation, and quickly the workflow starts to look a bit crazy. It's not linear at all. And together with that, then you start to really need to look deeply about like how do colors look next to each other in the palette. And I think Lynn talked about this yesterday in, I think it was at the data talk, touched on this with the sort of that Salesforce example with the making sure your palette works for color deficiency. So one of the areas where I really needed to make sure that colors seemed different was between our orange and our red. And these are two colors, two hues that can easily start to look like each other. So testing those so that there was enough difference, doing colorblind testing was really important. And so making sure those hues were different enough, and then testing that with sort of the different shades, the darker and lighter variations of that. I had to make sure that they didn't get too close to each other. An important area where people really needed to see the difference because it was expressing meaning is between our red and green, and that's well known to be one of the more difficult colors to work with for color blindness. Luckily for us, and this is advice I would give to anyone, we didn't just rely on color alone to display this information, but it still felt important to try and make these different. And so I did a lot of testing with the red and green especially. So as well as color contrast, there's testing for color deficiencies. And I really think accessibility is important, and this is a quote from a talk I saw in San Francisco last year. I couldn't find the exact source of the slides, but Jennison is a manager an engineering manager at LinkedIn, and he said it's either accessible or it's not, and I totally agree with that. But our primary green still does not pass in all use cases. If you have the opportunity to start from scratch, try not to use green for like your primary buttons and stuff. It's really difficult to work with. Or it's at least difficult to work with in the sort of brighter ranges. So we debated this. We tried some much different, darker, sort of foresty greens. We also explored using changing our buttons to blue. But we just felt that this was too many changes to introduce in one go. So at the moment, we're working on edging towards getting things to pass and to be fully accessible. And so we're just stepping that direction. And because GitHub's a utility, people really notice these changes. So it's not ideal. I'm not happy with that, but we're working towards it. And then there's how colors interact within the same family. So it's worth looking at all the different shades in that same hue, and then also with your with white and whatever your dark black or your darkest gray is, and checking that how many combinations work color contrast wise. So this is the base default red. And then like with our darkest red, making sure that works with the lightest variations and then works well with white and black. And this helped me start to define some system rules. It's good to, it helped me like have some constraints around this and narrow down the color choices. So I started to define rules like that every base color must at least pass at AA large. And that the darkest and lightest colors in a hue must pass for small text. So that's something that I found helpful and helped me make decisions about what were good color combinations and what should be part of the new palette. So naming conventions. We can't have a design systems or CSS conference and not talk about naming things. So there's a way to approach this, and I think it's like figure out what's important for you. And some of the things that were important for us in our naming convention was like knowing what the color is by name alone. I want to look at that color in code and know exactly what it is. I want to be able to quickly internalize color names so that when I'm writing colors in code, I can remember the different variations of those colors. And also we want it to help aid vocabulary around conversations about color. So when designers and engineers are working together or with anyone else, hopefully the naming of those colors helps those conversations. So I picked some examples of Etsy, and they, just as I was leaving, they had started to introduce a different range of oranges for, I think stemmed originally by marketing, and I had to poke around the site the other day and see which ones were being used. And they have things like, they have the standard orange, but then they have Cara Cara, Creamsicle, Blinding, Sandstorm. Another example from Airbnb, they have Roche, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Babu, Archers, Hoff, Foggy. They're pretty cool names. And then like looking at other examples, material design have this sort of just tons of numbers. And I started to look at different, as well as different, how other companies were naming colors and different design systems. I started to look at different applications, design tools, like photography, editing software, and make lists of what words do people use to describe color. And I ended up feeling that it's really easy to quickly get confused about, like, is this like indigo, or is it just our blue, or it happens to be more purpley? And so I really wanted to stick with really simple, the simplest versions of color names as possible. So we ended up with things like this, and quite similar to material design with a lot less colors. But we kept with very simple color names. And not to say that Etsy and Airbnb color names don't work, but for us, that didn't seem to fit right. I've had a lot of conversations about when it comes to like class names in the markup, and we still have a bunch of things like this, but things like text warning, button danger, flash error, and they're all just red. Like why not just make them, text red, button red, flash red? And the reason I say that is because like I've many times working in code that has those sort of different names instead of just using the color, I find myself going like, wait, is it button warning or button danger, and things like that. So it's up to you. It's what works for you and your team, but that's something that I worry about sometimes. I think there's places for like where it might not be the best idea to name things by color. I think either of these can work. It depends on how your system is used. If you're using button primary and it's like part of a theme, and that color could change a lot, then maybe it doesn't make sense to call it button green. So think about these use cases and what works for you. So we're going to get a bit into nerdier zone right now. So I think a lot of people want to write a script and it just generate all these colors. And I'm sure that some people are really good at doing that and have done some good things. As I was exploring color, I noticed that there weren't, I couldn't find like a pattern that applied to the whole range of colors. Some colors were, the way that saturation worked was different as you went from the darkest to the lightest variation, whereas with something like grays, the saturation tended to bend quite differently, like this. And then looking at hue, I've seen some blog posts saying, oh, keep the hue exactly the same. I personally don't agree with that, because I think it's more about how it's perceived, how it feels. Does it feel like it's in the same color family? And and sometimes with colors like orange, they can get kind of muddy, can get more browny as you get dark, or more red. And if you're trying to do something like make sure that feels quite different from your red color range, then you might need to bend the hue a little bit. So I couldn't find any like really clear patterns there. Also, I really like this example, which is from Interaction of Color. I don't know. Yeah, we probably can't see the difference on this screen, but you can see the numbers. That's why I put them there. So in the, I guess the 1, 2, 3, 4 example. I can't do left and right when I'm looking at an audience. The mixing of red and black is stepped in equal amounts. But what happens is it doesn't look like that. It's perceived differently, and 3 and 4 actually blur into each other. Whereas if you double that and go 1, 2, 4, 8, then the actual perceived gradation seems like it's equal, even though it's technically not equal. And this is an example of I'm not sure how to pronounce this, whether it's Weber-Fechner Law. I'm terrible. But it's about, this law is about the relationship between actual change and perceived change. And it's really, really fascinating. And this is just another way where I was like, how this looks is not mapping to how this is in code. So it's difficult. I think what's perceived is hard to calculate, not impossible, just hard. Rune Madsen had an example of procedurally generating colors, and he recreated the material design orange scale. And it's not quite the same, but it's close. And so maybe doing something that works for you, maybe the time saved is worth it. There's also a great site called Palex, made by Brent Jackson, and this steps through hues in equal amounts around, I guess, 360, and then uses luminance to generate different shades of those colors. And it gets pretty good results, and so maybe this works for you, or maybe you use it as a starting point and then adjust. So programming color, not impossible, just difficult. Maybe a bit of this kind of stuff going on. Okay, so shipping, how did we do? So this is the old versus new color. Can you see the difference on the screen? Probably not much, huh? But of course, we were extending the ranges of those colors. It wasn't just these hues. What we did in the first ship was remove, I think it was like 579 of those hex values in one go, which was 23% of the code base for colors, or percentage of the colors updated, which is quite a lot in one ship. All right, I thought it was. What's interesting, though, is what was perceived to have changed. And I think this is something that's worth thinking about in design systems. If you're working on a large-scale web app like GitHub, you don't always have the opportunity to update everything to the new system in one go. That's not possible. So it's interesting to figure out how much needs to change for it to seem new and to feel like everything's been updated. And that's where it kind of landed for us. So how have we done since then? Made a little bit of progress, not as much as I would like, but there's a lot of competing priorities to work on with design systems, but we're chipping away at it. But really, what did people think of this update? So borrowing the hashtag opinions from Mina, Twitter had some opinions. Some people thought this was quite bright. I kind of like this one because Joe Groff is like, what's the deal with these new GitHub colors? And then he follows up with a tweet saying, oh, it's really helpful though, thanks. I'm like, thanks for that. This is one of my favorite ones because I was like, hell yeah, I want it to feel like this when you use GitHub. Who wouldn't? But what this experience really taught me is color is such a relative medium. It's the most relative medium in art, as Joseph says in Interaction of Color. And it's very interesting to understand and learn what we can control and what we can't. We can control the palette, like we can choose what it is. We can choose the composition. We can't exactly choose what data fills up those pages and that adjusts the layout and such, but we can kind of control that. But what we can't control is whether someone has color deficiency issues, whether they're looking at GitHub on their phone and some light is shining on their screen, whether they've got not a very new monitor or older computer or a different browser. We can't control like how people are viewing it, how they're observing it, and in what context. But this is stuff that you can test for, and it's something that I really feel like I'd like to test a lot more of. And the other thing is, like, you know, we didn't get everything right. I feel like this was a good V1 of our color system. As many people say, like, design systems are never really done. They should be built for change. And that's something that you should think about when you're building any parts of the system. So I felt happy. I was like, cool, we introduced a new color system, we improved color contrast in a ton of places, we made colors easier to work with for our designers, we definitely made things look less drab, maybe a bit too far away from that. And so yeah, I felt good about that, but you know, it's baby steps. So thank you very much.
Awesome. So I'm just going to ask a few questions. Great presentation. I love how detailed you went with all the color theory. So my first question to you is, if somebody wanted to learn more about color theory, do you have any resources that you would recommend?
Well, number one, obviously, interaction of color. Number two, I would say I really love Rune Madsen's, I guess it's an online book in a way, Programming Design Systems. He does a really great kind of like short history of color theory, and then starts to, with each sort of section, he goes into ways that you can kind of program with color or any other parts of the system. So I think that's really good to give you some like quick history, and then also like what's useful to actually learn about. And then from there, I've just found myself on many Wikipedia pages when I'm like, I want to know more about this law. Also, there's a iPad app for doing the exercises in the Interaction of Color book, which is really interesting and fun.
Oh, like a little workbook?
It's like you slide the colors into, you have to like pick get the color experiments right and pick the hues and see how, and pull them into the shapes. Because the way that they did those tests was with paper initially, and it's sort of mimicking that, but on an iPad app.
That sounds really fun, actually. So next question comes from the Twitter world. Also, I'm wondering this, what tools do you actually use for testing accessibility?
Definitely used Colorable a lot. Made by Brent Jackson.
Do you know the link to that?
It's colorable.jacksonblack.com. I'll tweet it.
Okay, great.
Or he'll tweet it because he's here. Also, Spectrum, I think, is the Chrome tool I used for as a Chrome plugin for testing color blindness, color deficiency. So that I used a ton, and just using, I like Color Picker because often I just wanted to do quick spot checks in places, so I use that a bunch too.
Is that the desktop extension?
Yeah. I have been making a list of these. I will put them online and share them. Awesome.
So speaking of testing, do you ever A/B test or user test the color changes?
We couldn't do that with this because this is actually a lesson in sort of the expense of not having design systems and not having a color system in place. There was really no way that we could easily put all of that stuff behind a feature flag. It was like it's not impossible, but we decided not to do that because of the timeline that we wanted to do this in and the effort that it would require. So when people are like, when should I build design systems? I think of this example, like as early as possible because you pay for it later. So we didn't with this, but they have been testing they do A/B testing on the sort of sign-up forms and things like that, which have involved some of the colors, but not uniquely. I think we'll soon be in a place where we can do that now that we have a system.
Yeah, that's really good advice too. Get those sign systems up as soon as possible. So on that note, like, how do you advocate for updating the color system or including accessibility within your company?
I mean, part of me is like, it's 2017. Like, are we still having this discussion?
Yeah, we are sometimes.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to lie, that's definitely been part of the discussion, and we could have, but we chose not to do that in every single context, because we were trying to we made sure everything was an improvement, and it was a rule of ours to make sure there was no degradation in the experience, and everything had to at least improve, and most stuff we did manage to get past. I think, like, I didn't have to have too much of a deep discussion about that, because I think a lot of people were just like, yeah, this isn't great, right? That we feel bad about this. And it affects, it affects a large amount of the population, but also affects everyday use cases, like those moments where you're using it with light shining and things like that.
Just outside.
Yeah. And then for some companies, there is a monetary value. Like, some people will have requirements about using versions of software, and kind of like government and universities, and some of those use GitHub. So there's some ways you can, if people don't just want to do it anyway, you can track it to the bottom line.
Cool. All right, my last question for you is, what's your favorite color?
Black.
That's a very New York answer, I will say. Thank you so much, Diana.
Thank you.